My name's Eric Mill. I work for the General Services Administration, the most excitingly named agency in the federal government, for a team there called 18F, which is, we just started about 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And our job there at 18F is to do technology right for the federal government. We are in the federal government. We are all full-time federal employees, and we work with a variety of agencies and the White House and a whole bunch of other things, sometimes even other branches of government. Sometimes we help build them stuff from scratch, sometimes we help consult with them, sometimes we help design stuff. So we do a bunch of things. One of the things that I've worked on there a lot is sort of making sure that we are good about the web and user security and privacy. Most of what 18F does, at least today, are web-facing applications. And in the world of civic technology today, that's still mostly the case. And actually, all the stuff that we're going to talk about today applies just the same to native applications anyway. So you can take everything I'm talking about and also apply to what your phone is doing, not just what your web browser is doing. I'm going to hit a bunch of things, but they're going to fall. There we go. I'm going to talk about basically three things. So one of them is we're going to talk a little bit about how you actually can guarantee privacy on the network at large scale. And on the web today, that means something called HTTPS. And so I'll go into a bit of that and why that has such momentum right now behind it and why we're moving to that as a default for the web. I'm going to spend some time also talking about third parties, so other domains and other services that get integrated into the web, and that's something that gets a lot less attention and a lot less understanding than encryption. So I'm actually going to try to go into as much detail as I can there, and I'd really like to field some questions about that because that is something that needs more effort. And then finally, I want to talk about, and this will be the more technical part, so I want to talk just a little bit about HTTP 2. Which is literally the sequel to HTTP, the protocol, which was the first time that HTTP has been revised since 1999 and was just finalized in May. So it's a big deal and has strong ramifications on user privacy and user security and performance. So I'm going to go through the HTTPS stuff relatively quickly. So 18F took a strong stance out the gate that we're just going to use HTTPS all the time. We are always going to use a secure connection. Doesn't matter what we're doing. Doesn't matter if it's public open data, all the better. And we do that because it is fast, much faster than a lot of people think, because it guarantees a lot of really important properties that users should be depending on the web today. And just, we're not going to have any exceptions. We're even going to be a little bit unreasonable about it so that we always make the right decision and we never make a mistake and not think that something is sensitive when it is. Over the course of time, we ended up collaborating with other parts of the government, and eventually the U.S. federal government actually declared this the standard for the entire federal government, at least for the executive branch, that just says, we are all going to do HTTPS, and we're going to only do HTTPS. So, as it says there, as they release this federal policy from the Office of Management and Budget in the White House, it is HTTPS only by the end of next year, and it took it took the stance that there is no such thing as insensitive web traffic today, and that whether it's the Coral Reef Task Force or the Inspector General's whistleblowing hotline form, those things are equally deserving of privacy and security as things travel across the network. Some entities outside the government have also been pushing this pretty hard over the last year. Google sent some waves by declaring that encryption would itself be a ranking signal. Mozilla has announced that they're trying to phase out non-secure HTTP altogether, not by literally just cutting it off, but by removing the ability for insecure sites to use helpful features like geolocation and other things. Chrome is doing something similar. They're going to be playing around with the URL bar and trying to find ways to, instead of showing unencrypted websites as neutral, as just not marked, they actually want to show that this is actually non-secure. You should not like this, right? And that's something that is both of those things really have to be tied to the overall growth of encryption on the web. It doesn't have to hit 100%, obviously, but it has to get to the point where these browsers aren't giving alert fatigue to people, right, where people still respond to this and think that it's a problem. So these are plans that they're taking in phases. So like why is all this happening, right? Like, and why kind of all of a sudden, and why all this attention? Like, why do I and a bunch of other people spend just so much time being really annoying to other people about HTTPS? And the reason is that there is literally no other protocol with the scope and scale at use today than HTTP. And HTTP, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, is that though it was invented for web browsers, though it is, you're used to seeing it there, that turned out to just be a much more handy way of communicating on the internet generally than like raw TCP or inventing your own protocol. So HTTP is actually just used by your native apps, by your IM client, by just about everything that talks on the web, on the internet today, actually has absorbed this protocol that was invented for the web. So, you know, your Internet of Things, your smartphones, your web browsers, just HTTP is everywhere, and all the things that you've come to rely on in your life generate HTTP requests and responses and travel across an unknown network, right? So to try to make this slightly visual, right? So like when you are talking on the internet, which is just two computers talking to each other, there's nothing special about servers on the internet, right? They're just computers without monitors. When you do that, you are asked, when you ask for a website and you get it back, that's travel on the network. And what that really is you're sending information about yourself. So you're not just asking for president.gov or whatever. You're saying, by the way, my IP address is this number, which ties you to a location. I'm on Firefox, I'm 3.4 on Windows 7.1. I'm in the United States. I speak English. I've been here before. Here are the cookies last time I was here. Here's my ID from Google Analytics, because the website, just like just about every website, is using Google Analytics, right? So all that goes across the wire, and then the website comes back across the wire. And the real internet is not just two computers talking to each other, but it is a giant, crazy, unaccountable network of machines that involve like routers that haven't been patched since 2003, weird enterprise load balancers that take a year to get updated, if ever, a criminal with zeros and ones tumbling out of his sack, and a creepy warehouse that really exists over in Utah. So this is the actual internet that we built, and this was, when we made the internet, we made the web, this was basically something of a devil's bargain that we made, in that we prioritized growth. We prioritized the ability for anybody to add to the network, for anybody to talk over the network, permission-free, commodity metal can just like hook on and you're in. And that was probably the right priority in the 80s and 90s, but we didn't prioritize security at all. And we ended up with a web that was mostly unencrypted, and where the idea of encryption, where HTTPS itself was invented like under some engineer's desk at Netscape over a weekend in 1995, and was super insecure and was deprecated within like a year because it didn't even do a very good job the first time around, right? So we really didn't do a great job at security, and now we're dealing with it. And some of the nature of this devil's bargain has become much more obvious over time. So the quintessential example, and I'm going to show a few others, is Verizon finally got caught injecting tracking information into everybody's unencrypted traffic that used their network. Verizon is by far the biggest ISP. I think it's number one in the US. It's one of the world's biggest internet service providers. AT&T also was piloting a system like this, and how this works is that as your traffic is going over the internet, over an unencrypted connection, the network is, because it's unencrypted, because there's no authentication, you're just sending plain text through anybody's computer, that network was taking that traffic and just injecting a little tracking header, so another just bit of text, and just adding it as a header into, basically from the back. So the sort of term of art that came up for this was super cookie, because it is essentially a cookie that you can't delete. It's not a cookie that appears in your browser anywhere. It's kind of backdoored into your traffic, and is not something that has any accountability. And this is from a service provider that you're already paying a lot of money to for the actual service of providing your traffic. So this was a big deal, and there were letters from the Senate and all this stuff, but they still didn't change their behavior. You can now opt out after months and months of pressure, but it's still the default. Sorry. And I really, I kind of want to take this to the next level is that just by Verizon doing this, just by Verizon adding a unique header onto traffic, any company can actually just like piggyback on top of that, right? Especially if you're collaborating with Verizon, but not even if you don't even have to. In this case, Turn, who I had never heard of before this, was an advertising partner of Verizon that was using it to basically, even if you cleared your cookies for Verizon or from Turn, or you went to incognito mode in your browser, they could use the presence of this Verizon tracking ID to essentially reestablish who you were from your other non-incognito session or from before you deleted your cookies and just keep the link intact, right? And this was, like, nobody has any idea that that is happening in the world, but that is the one ISP and the one partner company that has even been caught doing that. Whenever anybody has gone and looked at like what the ISPs the world over are doing, programs like this, you know, while not always so egregious, are actually quite common. I don't have a slide for it, but just a month or so ago, an Australian internet service provider was passing phone numbers of customers over headers in unencrypted traffic when people visited websites that the Australian ISP had a business deal with. So it's just really, like, people didn't really get, people have just been assuming for essentially the first 20 years of the web that internet service providers, like, you know, eventually people realize maybe they're going to try to like force Netflix to, you know, let them move their traffic around or get paid by Netflix. People kind of caught on to that in the last 5 or 6 years. But it took a long time for people to ever assume that internet service providers would actually just essentially become attackers and actually modify your traffic maliciously. So to take this, the final little horror slide I have here, does anybody remember when GitHub had a denial of service attack put on them? So this was in April of this year, and that attack was, you know, multi-stage and really interesting, and it was very scary. But it's most of it, and it's by far its biggest firepower was that a Chinese nation-scale network basically took. When people visited a website that used a service called Baidu Analytics, Baidu is a Chinese company, offers a lot of Google-like services, has a Google Analytics-like service, and just like Google Analytics, it defaults to unencrypted traffic for unencrypted websites. This nationwide network, as random people within that network visited any site that happened to use this analytics snippet, that network rewrote in flight, added a little bit of JavaScript to just ping GitHub. So it essentially weaponized a massive number of people, and it wasn't even hard, right? They just have to flip a switch to rewrite the traffic. Like that, whoever was operating that nation-scale network did not actually have to spend any CPU cycles themselves doing the DDoS attack. They were just passing along instructions to people's computers to do it. So that's like an absurd, cartoonish attack on unencrypted traffic. And it's kind of shocking that they did that because it was so obvious and animated so many people. But that is another example of the world that we're in today. And I didn't go into detail here, but they were specifically attacking materials on GitHub that were relating to working around firewalls. To wrap up the HTTPS section here, so Wikipedia, after a relatively fierce public and internal debate, decided to move to encryption just in June. So Wikipedia was somewhat of a laggard in comparison to a lot of its sort of Silicon Valley-ish peers in turning on encryption, and that was in part because they were really concerned about running up against censors. That's how they start off their blog post about it. Because one of the things about HTTPS is that you can only block the entire site or none of the site because you don't get access anymore to which individual page people are visiting on a site. So this actually ran them directly into Russian censors. As in the last couple of years, the Russian government has created an agency just to decide what websites are okay for people to visit. And they got really upset about a page that was involved in drug information. And their complaint was specifically like, hey, Wikipedia, turn off HTTPS so that we can do our job. Wikipedia did not do that, and the censors backed down. And that was pretty much the first like really awesome on the global stage, high profile success of HTTPS actually making a difference in a power relationship between a major company and a major government. So, now to get a little bit more concrete, a lot of concerns about HTTPS are pricing. I'm not trying to endorse individual vendors here. I just brought up a couple of examples of, when people talk about how expensive turning on encryption can be. It is, when you talk about getting certificates today, we're talking about paying the same amount that you pay for a domain name. We're talking about paying, $10, $16 a year, less than that. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt around paying for much more expensive varieties of certificates. And there are lots of companies in the world that have lots of incentives to convince you that those are more secure. But do not allow yourself to be taken in by that, because they are, in fact, just as secure and use the exact same math and are perfectly acceptable. And there's a free certificate authority launching in November that issued their first certificate just a couple weeks ago. That is worth keeping in mind and has some really important sponsors that, not just in civil society, but in the private sector, that you can expect to overall lower the cost of encryption across the entire web for people who use Akamai, Cisco, WordPress, and the companies that are represented on that list of sponsors, including the American Library Association. So, part of how I think about this, and I think about what the transition is going through, is that we are trying to return the internet and the web to its vision of a web of nodes, right? When you think of the internet, when you imagine the internet, at least hopefully I do, I imagine the computers at the edge of the internet. I imagine what people are reading, I imagine what people are writing, I imagine the applications people have built or are wielding, right? I don't think of it as a bunch of, like an oligopoly of companies with huge amounts of infrastructure and power that we sort of like dip in and lease things from and are accountable to. I don't think of the internet that way. I think of it as a bunch of nodes. And to me, when you move the default on the web, it doesn't have to get to 100%. When you move the default from unencrypted to encrypted, you are diffusing power out of the center and back out to the edges again, because the interactions that you're having on the web have returned to just being unmodifiable in between the user, like the reader and the writer, and the user and the publisher. So on that note, I want to talk a little bit about third parties, because this gets less attention. This is a rare example of a major news story where people paying attention to this. But I want to talk about the connections that we allow our websites to make to other websites, and the greater than the sum of its parts dynamic that emerges from that as well. So this is a recent story. Basically, Facebook made a business decision that they're going to publicly be explicit about, we will use the like buttons that you've embedded on your sites to track users' web browsing to better target ads. Maybe you have strong feelings about that particular use, maybe you don't. It's actually important to note, though, that they've been doing this for a long time. It's a story from 2014 about Facebook doing this, a story from 2012 about Facebook buttons doing this. I can remember back to 2010. I can remember some other news stories about that. That's because there's nothing novel about Facebook's like buttons. There's nothing. They don't have any crazy patents or science going on in their like buttons that allows them to track you across the web. All they do is they have convinced people to place little references like this into their websites at scale, right? And that doesn't just include, examples of that don't just include social media buttons. Certainly it includes Twitter, but it also includes basically any font you link to. It includes, when you link to jQuery over to Google's CDN there. Even, this is something from Medium. This is medium.com linking to its own separate CDN domain, which, at least they own both parts of it, but that CDN is probably operated by a different company than their main hosting, so that's just another company involved in the mix. And of course, Google Analytics, which is probably 90% of websites that people visit today, or more. And so one of the, to try to communicate like what actually is going on and why companies run this, when we look back at this, Typekit serves its fonts, and they have licensing agreements to font publishers. Google fonts, what value is Google getting out of helping people publish fonts online? And why don't they offer, they're actually very easy to download and there aren't any licensing concerns. So it's very possible to self-host a Google font, but they don't offer that at all, right? Why do all these things come up, and why do people find it worth it to pay huge sums of money to run these CDNs as a favor for the rest of the web, right? So Add This is an example of a company whose specialty is social media sharing buttons. I've personally seen it on most .gov websites that are used by any significant number of people. Add This, this is I think from last year, they were caught, and one of the few that are actually caught, doing something called fingerprinting. So they took your browser and they had you render, this is invisible, just you can't see this in the page, but add this in addition to like rendering the social media buttons, would also do this invisible canvas thing where they asked your browser to render like a pretty intricate series of colors and letters and icons with this weird set of rectangles and highlighting. And it turns out that essentially implicates like what fonts you have installed, what operating system you're running, what versions of whatever you have installed, and is totally sufficient. Like even most computers will do a very slightly different, like at least 1 pixel different version of that image. And that allows them to essentially turn that into an ID code and turn it into a cookie that they can track you. And even if you're in incognito mode, it's another kind of super cookie that allows you to track yourself, or allows them to track you all over the internet. And that's not something that AddThis like talks about. That's not part of their marketing or anything. And people just don't even understand that's going on. So ProPublica drew some attention, but that's still basically the dynamic. A little closer to home, EFF raked healthcare.gov through the coals a few months ago for pinging about 13 different third-party websites. I mean, some of those were useful and some of those were less useful. All of them, though, one of the main lines of criticism here is that healthcare.gov included sensitive information in the URL itself. And so when you ping these third-party domains, the URL that you're visiting from is passed along to those third-party domains as the refer. And so essentially people's demographic information that happens to be in the URL structure of the site was passed along. It's not saying you should be, you probably should be a little paranoid about your URL structure, but the bigger issue there is that the team at healthcare.gov, just simply was not even thinking about that. They were not even aware that that's a thing. And in fact, most people are not, and I wasn't thinking about it until like a year or two ago. And this taught me a bunch too. So it's a lot of it is about awareness raising about what's even happening. Gigya runs a CDN. So just to move a little bit from privacy to security, right? Every time you pull in a third-party domain into your site, you open up attack surface for your site to be attacked. So Gigya runs a CDN at cdn.gigya.com. They serve some socialized JavaScript file. And I think it was GigaOM, is like a tech news site, was using it. And the Syrian Electronic Army like compromised cdn.gigya.com. Now they only used it to do like some alert pop-up that's like, thank you, Syrian Electronic Army. But they could have injected basically any code into that. Once, because your browser is set to blindly execute any content from a third-party domain unless you take action otherwise, right? So that's another thing that people are not used to thinking of as an attack vector, but totally is. And I'm just repeating the same slide as before to note that this was an example of making use of that and rewriting a third-party service in flight by Baidu Analytics that people were using, and that allowed a large-scale attack that weaponized people who had embedded that third-party service. The media is particularly bad about it. I just kind of want to like point to this one example just to really show like how rapacious the scene can be. So this is stlouistoday.com. Has 168 third-party host names. Oh, it gets cut off a little bit here, but if you visit stlouistoday.com, at least when I took the screenshot, it makes 1,134 requests to 168 host names and transfers 30 megabytes. And all of that is invisible. It's probably just a little bit annoying, and the ads are weird, and probably that site sucks. But like, most, and the media on the web is in a particularly bad position where their business model is going away. And so they're increasingly turning to tracking services. But the fact that somebody can even do that and that it's not even a big deal and doesn't get them completely like hauled in front of the FTC or Congress or the courts or whatever is very, very strange to me. So aggravating problems around third-party services, it is totally invisible to users. With encryption and HTTPS, you at least get this green lock, and people hinge a lot of They try to use that to educate and change people's behavior. It's also, you can train people to look for it. It's not great. It's just a lock and could be better, but it's something. Whereas with third-party domains, unless you happen to see like the domain flashing by in the bottom left of your browser that it briefly connects to some domain, and it doesn't even do that for all domains, you're just not going to see it. And in fact, most browsers don't really have great incentives to help you find this. So Apple, well, less Apple, but Google and Microsoft in particular profit directly as companies from data sharing. And so though they have lots of great people and lots of great teams that probably agree with everything I'm saying, they're still not necessarily going to end up as leaders on this issue the same way that they will on encryption. And finally, this is probably the most important, honestly, is that since browsers aren't going to help, it really has to come from the community that makes websites. And developers have been trained to prefer using CDNs. CDNs have been considered this best practice to get caching benefits and stuff for a long time. And it's like less work to just drop in a thing of code instead of hosting something. So developers have been trained to think that that's actually just better and that there really aren't any risks. And so countering that and changing that belief is quite challenging. Certainly you can do things like inline Google fonts. We did this for 18F's website, where I had to install a command line tool and run it on this thing and figure out some command line options. And when I was done, it was inlined. And we've done this for a few of our sites. It's kind of a pain to do. You should still do it, but Google Fonts doesn't really make that easy. And if you were going to go and argue inside Google to, maybe start prioritizing exports and hosting instead of hot linking, it'd probably be a tough argument. Anybody use Discourse? Anybody heard of that? A discussion platform? So I got into a mild argument with them on their on their meta discourse. Is that in Discourse 1.4 is like a week ago, they started defaulting to the default avatars. So if I didn't set my avatar in Discourse, my name is Eric, and so it would make a little E, right? And that's become a little more commonplace today, is to kind of spice default avatars up a bit. And but I guess Discourse engineer it, so they generate those on demand. So they're like, well, that's really expensive. So in the next version of Discourse, it will just default to pulling those from avatars.discourse.org, even if you're totally otherwise detethered from discourse.org and are hosting it yourself at like discourse.18f.gov or something. And it should be obvious that I think that's a big deal, and I think that is a problem. And so we went back and forth, and I really didn't feel like I was being heard for a while. Though now it looks like they're actually going to move it to a server-side proxy, where it will just talk to the server hosting the discourse, and then that server might in the back go and ping avatars.discourse.org, which solves most of the privacy things anyway, even if there's still a bit of a security risk. GitHub did something interesting recently where they used something. It's a new standard called sub-resource integrity. This is getting a little bit more technical, but it's really only useful if you're pulling from like your own CDN where you control the content, but you still want to protect against your CDN getting compromised. You can actually specify a little hash of the content so that the browser makes sure that it hasn't been changed in transit, which is really useful. Although obviously, it means that if you ever change the content, you have to change the hash at the same time. So there's some difficulties, but it's a nice defense in depth mechanism. Also, like something else you could do that people don't really think about, there is actually a government agency whose job it is to care about privacy. They're even running a privacy conference in January, and that is the Federal Trade Commission. And you can actually complain to them. If you think that, if you are concerned about how a company is handling your personal information, you have privacy concerns, they have like a well-lubricated form to help you do that. And the more that they hear from people and about the things that I'm talking about, the more likely they are to be able to win the arguments internally to start directing resources to pay attention to them. So that's something that people don't really think about a lot, but that's very much an avenue you have at your disposal. So the last bit, we're actually doing very good on time. So the last section here I want to talk about is HTTP 2. I'm actually curious, who here knew that HTTP 2 existed coming into this? So, okay, about half of you. That's good. That's more than I expected, although, could be more. So HTTP 2 came out in May, and that's the first time HTTP has been revisited since 1999, when HTTP 1.1 came out. And the web in 1999 was so crazy different. Websites, were much smaller. They were basically just a page and a few images. Maybe they were pulling down some JavaScript or CSS once in a while. and HTTP was optimized for that. So as HTTP 2 went through the process, they decided to basically use it to focus on performance for the most part, to deal with the web as it exists today. So there's actually even more stuff than here, but so HTTP 2 is binary, it's not text. It's multiplex, which I'll show in a slide. It compresses headers, can allow servers to push stuff down without even being requested. But the most important thing to understand is that it is fully multiplexed, and what that means is that instead of just the browser saying, "Hey, give me the page," it waits to get the whole page. "Hey, get me the CSS file," waits to get the CSS file, then gets the next file, back and forth. It's able to get those things in parallel, so it can just get the page and then ask for every single resource on the page simultaneously, and then the server can parallelize its work and return it in whatever order it cares about. So that is massively more efficient. And to sum this up, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is what that means is that you are strongly incentivized to use as few domain names as possible when building your website, right? So you now will get tremendous speed benefits and may not even get the same CDN benefit that you were hoping from if you're not a tremendously large site. That you may just be able to have all of your assets on one domain. So HTTP 2, I just said it rewards using as few domains as possible because of the way that it coalesces connections to multiplex stuff. And it also requires encryption. That it doesn't actually require that in the spec, and this was a hugely political thing that everybody fought about for a whole year. And it looked for a while like Chrome and Firefox were going to be the only browsers that insisted on encryption, which is leaving them a little stranded. And then Chrome and Firefox also ended up disagreeing on whether or not they were going to enforce it. It's getting a little fine-grained in the detail, but Firefox essentially assumed that it would be too hard for the web to go to HTTPS in a fast enough manner, and so they were going to allow people to do it's called opportunistic encryption, where it'll be encrypted, but they don't actually verify that the encryption wasn't changed in transit. It's like a weaker form of HTTPS that doesn't really do a lot. But that ended up getting moot over the course of the next year, and now Safari and Internet Explorer and Edge and Chrome and Firefox are all going to require encryption to do HTTP 2. So if you want all these wonderful, tremendous speed benefits, you have to turn on encryption. And that has become politically viable and is where things are going to go. If any of you are familiar with Speedy, which has been around since about 2010, which is Google's attempt to solve this problem first, HTTP 2 is essentially a somewhat of a sequel to Speedy. So they took Speedy and then made some modifications on top of it. So I want to also, there's one other technical concept to mention that has privacy ramifications and expense ramifications, which is server name indication, which is a extension to HTTPS that was finalized in 2003, and that allows you to use just one IP address that serves multiple certificates. So which sounds kind of obvious, but it really is the case that before server name indication, and just so you know, almost nobody requires server name indication. So in practice today, for a lot of people, you literally can't have multiple HTTPS certificates on one IP address, which has huge ramifications for CDNs like Akamai and CloudFront and all these other people. And the blocker for a lot of people has been Internet Explorer on XP. So even other browsers on XP are fine, but Internet Explorer 8 never got SNI, and Android 2.x and below also never got SNI. Android 2.x is not usually a huge concern unless you're mega large. Internet Explorer and XP has been a bit of a thing, but it's really worth it's worth paying attention to a couple of things. One is that this is from it got cut off at the top, but it's analytics.usa.gov. It's a federal-wide web traffic portal, and one of the things that we fought really hard to include in the initial launch was to actually expose, because almost nobody does this publicly, the direct browser and operating system statistics that we get, including down to versions of Internet Explorer. So we were able to show that Internet Explorer 8 and below are, at least when I took this a couple weeks ago, down to 4%. XP has been trending down. Like when we launched it, I think XP was around like 3.3%, and now it's down to 2.6%. It's basically going down 0.1% every month. But the even more encouraging thing is that even this data is really misleading, because there are definitely, this is just going across the whole federal government, and there are definitely some legacy audiences out there. But if, in your site, and especially in new things that you do, you may find very much lower numbers than this. So as an example, I got permission to share these stats from everykidinapark.gov, which launched in August, got a lot of attention, got 400,000 visits in like a few weeks, and had 0.6% visits from IE8 or below, which is essentially, that means Internet Explorer on Windows XP, because Internet Explorer 9 won't run on XP, it's only available on Windows 7 and up. So that really means that, and I know that certainly for most of the government and for most sites, if they actually look at what people are using, they're going to find some amount of encouragement. And actually, so the US Web Design Standards, that was an 18F and US Digital Service collaboration, launched a bit earlier this week. They also made the decision to just support Internet Explorer 9 and up. And they were comfortable at least launching with this and seeing if they get complaints. But we don't expect any complaints, because especially for new things that people are redesigning, it's probably going to be okay. And there are going to be ways to gracefully degrade if not. So it's really worth, this is just like an assumption that people haven't been checking recently, that there's still too much Windows XP out there, at least Internet Explorer on XP. And that is finally an assumption that in 2015 you can check. And by doing that, you can essentially start telling your CDNs and vendors that server name indication is okay, and you can cut your, it's absurd actually how much the cost benefits can be once you're able to just do one IP address for all of the CDN's clients. Right? Like when you deploy something onto Akamai or CloudFront or whatever, you are deploying your site to like hundreds of servers just spread physically around the globe. And if each of those need to have their own IP address for each site that they have, that means that your site is personally reserving like hundreds of IPv4 addresses that the world is running out of very quickly and are very expensive. So we really need to stop using them. And this is I'm trying to kind of connect the dots here between like something as banal as Internet Explorer 8 usage and our ability to like scalably make a secure network in the world. And those two things are very connected, and you should take a look at them. So sort of, my attempt to make some takeaways here are, with HTTPS, don't take no for an answer. And this specifically, don't take no for an answer from, if you're a government and you have contractors and vendors, they really enjoy saying no about this. You're often asking them to make an infrastructure change that affects all of their clients. They hate requests like that, but you need to press them and maybe go find out who their other clients are and convince them to press them as well, because they are, one website going over to HTTPS helps a lot. Having an entire large-scale vendors' websites all be able to go HTTPS helps an amazing amount, and you can contribute to that as well. So similarly, don't take crazy expensive quotes that you may get from a CDN or vendor for an answer as well, especially if you're able to go and look at dropping IE8 support. You can make a very cogent argument that there's no valid reason for them to rake you over the coals for money. Finally, hopefully I was able to communicate that every third party, even something as simple as linking to jQuery on Google's CDN, their massive intelligence centers that they run, that every third party is an intelligence center, and every third party is an attack surface. It's not unique to Facebook like buttons at all, and that this is something that, for better or worse, is running against the grain of how developers have been trained from like 2007 to 2013. We now have to kind of change how we've been doing things, and it's not going to come from the browsers for the most part, the pressure to do that. And finally, HTTP 2, my experience is that not enough people still know that this exists. And and for people who have heard of it, you may be aware that it requires encryption. You may be aware that it's very fast. But for me, it's really been only recently that I've really started to see just how valuable HTTP 2 is as a strong incentive enforcing function to ratchet up privacy on the web. So even though I had a bunch of, to me, horrifying slides on this talk, I actually am very optimistic about the internet getting more private and more secure over time, even in a world that feels like users don't have much of a voice and get taken advantage of. So I'm very optimistic, and there's a part that we all can play in whatever part of the web we happen to run. So that is the end of my talk, and I have the time for questions, I hope. So thanks very much. So, any questions at all? Anybody doing any of this stuff at home? Yeah.
So I've just been running into the HTTPS stuff a lot lately, and I have just barely enough knowledge to be really dangerous. And my go-to solution so far has been to get Cloudflare coverage.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, is that A, a terrible idea, B, an okay idea, or C, a really good idea?
So it's not a terrible idea, and it is. You're right that it's complicated. So what he's talking about is, so you can use, and Cloudflare is just one example. This applies to a lot of CDNs out there. When you put something like Cloudflare in front of your website, and Cloudflare has done an amazing job at expanding HTTPS on the web, and they offer it free, so $0 to anybody who signs up, as long as you're willing to require server name indication, and use some newer algorithms and stuff. So as long as you're willing to support mostly modern browsers, then they will give you, whatever, I clicked on the wrong link. But the point is that they give you free HTTPS. But the issue is that it's not magic, right? Like, they're a CDN, so people will start talking to Cloudflare servers instead of yours. But then Cloudflare has to talk to your servers as well, right? So if Cloudflare has essentially become an authorized man in the middle to your traffic, you've decided that it's okay for them to do that. But if you haven't secured the line between Cloudflare and between your website, there's still some vulnerability there, both privacy and security. So it really depends on what you want to do. I mean, and Cloudflare argues, and they're correct, that most of the vulnerabilities that HTTPS solves are at that last mile between the user and the first point of the server. So it's definitely it's a huge benefit. And if you need a CDN, especially one that does DDoS protection, this is an option that is available to you, and you shouldn't feel like you're doing something bad. But it does, however, mean you need to be aware, right? One of the benefits of just being super unreasonable about HTTPS in general is that people can stop thinking about it. There's no more subjective decision making. With Cloudflare, you can make a mistake. An example of that is Mayday, the super PAC that Lawrence Lessig started. When they had their I raise $4 or $5 million in a day. Their donation form was behind Cloudflare on GitHub pages. So it was not encrypted between Cloudflare and GitHub pages at all. So I should mention that the donation, submitting your credit card information, was sent over a secure channel. But that was because the form itself was served over an insecure connection between Cloudflare and GitHub. If anybody got in between those two people, they could have tweaked the form as it arrived to users and siphoned lots of money. That was a very high value target. And there are actors in the world, that's certainly not anything individuals can probably do, but there are actors in the world that can. So that was, I think, they made a mistake by not being aware of Cloudflare's limitations. So that was a long answer. Yeah.
Eric, let's talk more about GitHub pages, because lots of
Sure.
Civic technology
Yep.
are using them, a lot of governments are using them. What's the best way to use them securely?
So you can certainly put Cloudflare in front of it, which has all the things I just mentioned. Probably fine most of the time, but you could make a mistake, which is not great. What we have done at 18F is we did this thing called 18F pages, because we needed reliable HTTPS. GitHub Pages doesn't do HTTPS at all for custom domains. To be clear, you can do things like go to a github.io domain over a secure channel, but if you ever write GitHub support about this, they're very quick to respond that's an undocumented feature, we don't support that, could go away at any time. And they added it there without telling anybody. And they don't support it at all for any custom domains that you use. So there's really not an awesome solution just within the confines of GitHub Pages. There's no perfect way. GitHub needs to do something, and they haven't announced anything that they're going to do. Maybe some other people are going to wait for Let's Encrypt to launch, but I have no information to suggest one way or the other. One thing that we did was we made essentially the idea of GitHub Pages is actually pretty simple, where you just whenever you update a repo, take the contents, build it in Jekyll, publish it somewhere. And so we ended up making our own open source system for doing that has started seeing a little bit of use around the government. So it's become a generic open source project. So basically when we make a repo, we push to an 18F pages branch, and that triggers the same workflow using GitHub's webhook system. So that clearly takes some work to do and is not ideal, but that's sort of the situation. Yeah.
One way that we've done it is we're proxying from our HTTPS site to HTTPS GitHub pages.
To the github.io
Yeah.
version? Yeah.
So that is HTTPS all the way along the line.
Mm-hmm.
But as an undocumented feature, it is.
Right. So you set up your own proxy. You have a little server somewhere in the middle, and its whole job is to just go back and forth. Yeah, I think there's actually believe that the web design standards and anything at this URL does the same thing. So they set up a custom proxy to GitHub pages that does something similar. It's a good call.
So there isn't an obvious hole there.
There's not. Although, so when I've pressed GitHub about this, they have noted that, so they toss everything into a CDN at github.io, and that's run by Fastly at the moment. And it is not encrypted between Fastly and GitHub Pages' servers. And that is a link that you can do nothing about at all. And that's really where which is why, I haven't gone on a crusade or anything on like doing that, because you still can't make that total guarantee. Like GitHub just has to step up. Yeah, well, yeah.
Maybe this is straying a little bit off topic, but I was really interested in what you were saying about training developers to think differently about third-party services. And I'm curious for your thoughts on all the third-party services that are not on the website user-facing side, but our own internal side.
Yeah.
Like Slack. Man, we're hooking everything up to Slack. Our GitHub,
Mhm.
probably Heroku, and I'm curious, like, how unreasonable could or should we be about some of that type of stuff? It makes things so easy, but it seems exponentially worse the more things we hook into it.
Yeah, I mean, so just the whole idea of using any third parties in the world that have your data in one place and connecting them together is like a really complicated scene that like I think you're right that organizations don't look at that holistically and kind of see the connection. So I work for the GSA and they were the first agency to move to Google Apps in the federal government. So we use that for Docs and Calendar and Mail, and then 18F also uses Slack as well. And at least in the parts that 18F controls, which includes GitHub as well, and we have some private repos, not our software for the most part, we have to take that really seriously. So we do, in fact, like we have a team and especially a person whose job it is to make sure that just yesterday he like smacked down somebody really hard for like hooking up Google Drive to Slack, right? Super easy to do, but like the assumptions that the organization has made about Slack and its level of sensitivity is very different than than how you're supposed to treat like just a generic file and document hub. So that is, it requires a lot of education even internally to an organization to think through that and try to generate positive behavior in a group setting. But it's very hard. Something that's maybe worth mentioning in terms of invisible things that aren't obvious in the browser is that the web host is a third party in all of these as well. And for the most part, for a lot of the internet, that wasn't a big deal because there was no like web host that had everybody. But now we kind of do, and part of that is CDNs that have taken over lots of the network edge, and some of that is also just Amazon Web Services, which is a system the likes of which the world has never seen of infrastructure and service that we are all touching every day. And Amazon has no public privacy policy that talks about how they handle information they collect at their network edge, because nobody's asked them to, because nobody thinks about web hosts as third parties. Yeah.
So just kind of building on that, I mean, I feel like a lot of kind of messages that get sent out at forums like these, government and tech forums involve, you can use the cloud, you can put it on Amazon,
Yep.
scales, like, How?
Right.
Well, I'm guessing you want to have a more nuanced conversation.
Yeah. HTTPS is like a Marshall conversation, and it's just you just do it and stop thinking about it. With third parties, they're useful, and you have to use them in order to get anything done. So it's more of a consciousness raising thing, and so, like as long as people are making eyes open decisions where they instinctively know that their URLs are going to be shared, where they instinctively know that what that third party's business model is, or just whether there are alternatives and what the trade-offs of those alternatives are, like that conversation's almost absent from the internet, aside from like the super intense folks at like EFF and ProPublica and a few other places that totally know it. Like that's where HTTPS was in like 2009 to 2013. That there's like the cause celeb of like the privacy activists and the journalists who really cared about it, but it had not broken into the mainstream. You just didn't see people making different decisions about it. That changed mostly on like domestic government surveillance stories, but hopefully the slides are enough to at least show part. You don't actually need to talk about domestic government surveillance to have a pretty compelling argument. But with third parties, like it's just not mainstream, even in the technology community. Yeah.
Coach from America Summit, there's a lot of talk about iterating, not being afraid to fail.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that, especially when the healthcare.gov article hit,
Mm-hmm.
Tracking and all that, there was a really palpable sense of outrage, and even a lot of "I told you so."
Sure.
So I just wonder how we reconcile, especially around this kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
simply because of the way it gets portrayed in the press.
Yeah.
Reconcile that. I mean, is it okay to iterate and fail on this stuff?
I mean, yeah, of course it is. There are people, so to the extent that I do any advocacy on this stuff, and there are a lot of people who do advocacy on privacy-related matters, people have wildly different tactics on how to generate change. And with HTTPS in particular, a lot of that was focused on the biggest corporations, where it was the least personal interaction. So people got really comfortable just like burning with fire to get their way. But that is really not that useful with smaller groups and governments of well-meaning people that are, especially at a small scale. So, with all of this stuff, like, it's hard. Because you need to get attention. You need to get people to understand it. It's probably worth showing some empathy, especially in your direct interactions with people. That like we're all learning this together. I didn't know. All the stuff I've ever learned about encryption was in the last 2 years. I mean, that's one of those things where you're striking a balance each and every day. Yeah, so is anything else people want to talk about?
This might be straying way off topic, but how do you feel about Cloudflare's cloud layer in China?
Here in my U.S. government capacity, I don't have really strong feelings about that. I mean, every company deals with each country a little bit differently, and whether if you Cloudflare will just face the same exact situation that Twitter did when they faced a lot of censorship demands. Twitter made this thing where they will only block tweets in the country that the censorship request comes from. Something I've noticed over time that Google does is Google is one of the few companies that has google.co.uk and google.in and google. All these things. I don't know of any other company that does that. But the reason I'm speculating here, but Google to me very clearly does that, so it can be we block the content on that one, and that's the one that has your country on it, and get off our backs. Some people, especially in Europe, are starting to not really take that very seriously as having actually removed the material, and the ever-evolving political landscape of censorship in large corporations continues to fascinate. Cool. Well, I think that's actually the end of the session. So I'll be around if anybody wants to just talk one-on-one. But thanks very much.